Okay, so next thing we need to consider is the amount of volume that we're giving the athlete or the lifter. And as with anything, volume and intensity very closely interact. Now, in the case of the deadlift, it's probably a little bit more sensitive compared to some of the other lifts, simply because typically, obviously, there's more absolute volume, that absolute intensity, absolute weight that can be lifted with something like the deadlift. And so it can be a little bit more volume sensitive. A little bit more volume can really push somebody over, can cause an injury even, right? It can really cause recovery deficits, a whole host of issues, right? So we need to be careful when it comes to just stacking on deadlift volume, which is something that, you know, it's almost logical to do, right? More work is better. But this is not the case, especially when it comes to the deadlift. So just understand the main thing is the sensitivity issue of volume increases with deadlift. If the overall recovery of the athlete becomes an issue, you're finding through whatever means that you have, whatever system that you have, and hopefully you do have a system of determining recovery for your client. Whenever you find that the recovery is an issue overall in the program, deadlift is probably the first place you need to take things away, right? Now, just quickly going back to like a system of recovery, and there's plans to do a video on a system of recovery that you guys can use. Probably by the time you're watching this recording, it may already be as part of the library on the educational portal. But what you need to do and what you need to understand is sometimes when it comes to recovery and tracking recovery, as coaches, we want this, you know, sometimes this elaborate way of measuring things and being super scientific or fancy. When it comes to recovery, believe it or not, subjective measures are actually extremely accurate at determining how recovered your client is. Subjective measures, like simple things like how good was your sleep? How would you rate it? How sore do you feel today? How motivated are you to train? What's your mood like? Things like that, questions like that can very easily, especially if it's, you know, a whole bunch of questions together, like one by itself is not enough. The more questions like that you have, and if you're able to sort of create some sort of a scoring system based on the answers, which is what we do, then you can track these scores over time and see that through the training week and through the training weeks, how recovered or under recovered a lifter is becoming, and then make changes accordingly. So if you find that recovery is starting to really suffer, then deadlift volume is probably the first place you need to cut down on, right? There are obviously some exceptions to that. One is if they are experiencing tendonitis in the elbow, and that's obviously because there's too much benching volume going on, then you're not going to decrease deadlift volume. You would make manipulations to the benching program there. But speaking as an overall, if overall recovery, systemic recovery is suffering, deadlift is probably the first place you want to cut volume. The other exception would be that if they're already on like a lower end of deadlifting volume, you know, like for example, you've got somebody who you've already accounted for that this person can only deadlift really once a week, and even then at like maybe 4 or 5 sets for that session, you know, they're really already at that lower end. There's probably not much less you can or should do, right? The problem is probably somewhere else. Maybe they've had a sudden lifestyle change. Maybe their squat volume is just simply too much, and maybe their accessory stuff is simply too much, right? Just too much junk volume in other exercises that's just simply not needed, and that can be cut out. The athlete will usually know pretty clearly when they're being affected by the deadlift. They will report certain things, you know, hands are hurting, lower back's really tender all the time, they're just feeling really tired all the time. And you may notice these patterns, especially after deadlift day, or even in the lead up to before a deadlift deadlift session comes up on the day. Like they're not really in the mood for training that day because the deadlift's on that day, right? This is something that you start to become accustomed to and you pick up as a coach as you do things over time. But those are just some things to look out for. The other thing you need to consider when it comes to assigning volume to a lifter is, are they actually built well for deadlifting for the amount of volume you want to give them? So for example, somebody who has short arms and even at the most efficient, optimal way of setup, they just have too much of a forward lean in their torso and their hip is just has no choice but to be too high up. That person is going to tax their lower back much more than somebody who's got longer arms and has the right limb lengths that allows them to set up for the perfect sumo deadlift, which will affect their lower back the least of all, right? The amount of volume that person A can do there compared to person B is completely different, and to be able to recover from that. So you need to take those things into consideration and then assign volume in accordance with that, because obviously overtaxing the lower back, not only is there the deadlift volume to get through, but also squatting volume to get through within a program. And that can start to cause some serious issues, as you can imagine. So how much volume should we do when all this is said and done? As a general rule, so we have the main lift, variation, and accessories. Now, if you go back to our videos on putting together a strength program, you'll know what each of those means. If you've been through that video, then you know what I'm talking about. So the main lift being the competition lift, let's just say if they're a conventional deadlifter. Within a week, these set considerations, by the way, are within a week, so in a week. And they're also, a set is considered as something that is 75% or more, 75% or more of their 1RM, and a set where they are anywhere between 3 or less reps left in reserve, right? So 3, 2, or 1 RIR at those other parameters, that's considered a set, right? So like a set of 6 at 60% of their 1RM is not going to be considered a set here, right? When we're talking about these numbers here. So the main competition lift that they're going to be doing, 4 to 6 sets per week. A variation that's going to address their weakness, also about 4 to 6 sets per week. An accessory work that will address any weak muscle groups, 3 to 5 sets per week within the context of a strength block. Okay. Now, when it's not a strength block, when we're in the off season, no comps coming up, and they're doing, say, hypertrophy work, it's almost skewed the other way, where there's much more accessory work, probably even in higher set numbers than 4 to 6 per week. And then there's some variation work and more minimal main lift work for various different reasons. But within the context of a strength block, that's kind of what you want to be aiming for. Now, that's a starting position, you have to understand. From there, you will start to make changes. You will assign something, and then you let that program run for a week or two, and then you'll have that system of identifying recovery, and you have a look at that and see how they're recovering. If their recovery is on track, fantastic. You can continue, or you can even choose to add a little bit if the recovery is like really good. But if you find that they are not recovering so well, then you need to start to cut out from some of those numbers. And then it comes down to the art part of coaching as to where do you need to actually cut out. Do they need to cut down from the main stuff, from the variation stuff, from the accessory stuff, a little bit of all of them maybe, and then be able to get the recovery back on track and get at it again. So as you can see, the pattern emerging here, volume and intensity interact together ultimately, and the determining factor on how much volume you do is ultimately recovery. Okay, so you want to be able to disturb the homeostasis to cause a change, and then for the body to be able to adapt, super compensate, and be able to do more in the next session, and be able to do that again and again without prematurely coming to a place where you need to do deloads and things like that. And that sort of ruins the rhythm of the program.